The checklist for what defines a Souls-like game looks nearly identical to the bullet points for a description of Hellpoint. From its respawn checkpoints in a labyrinthine world to losing all your XP when you die and having to retrieve it, it's all here, for better and for worse. But an elaborate sci-fi setting gives Hellpoint some character of its own, and a strong combat system made suffering through the extensive bugs mostly worthwhile. At the very start, you're plopped into a cloned body on a massive space station with zero explanation and left to fend for yourself against demonic entities and godlike beings. That's really the entire plot, basically, other than minor lore drops here and there. Much like Dark Souls, this is a world that's rich with palpable tension and mystery that leads you to pose questions constantly, even though they are seldom giving you answers. Visually, Hellpoint is quite stunning. It's tempting to just stop and stare for a few minutes at some of the vistas, especially outdoors. Interior areas are similarly stylized with bright popping colors that contrast the dark and decrepit tone incredibly well. A lot of love and care when it's the world building from a design perspective, and it makes me immensely curious to see and learn more. Of course, that also makes the lack of a real story more of a sore point. During my approximately 20-hour playthrough, it swung back and forth between the amazingly surreal, occultist-inspired atmosphere and a feeling of utter frustration at the sheer lack of direction and communication. Granted, it's more or less standard for Souls-likes to not have a map screen, but here that omission makes Hellpoint seem more aimless than usual because of the sheer scale of the world. It's a drag that fast travel can't be relied on to zip you across the maze of a map. The item needed to synchronize checkpoints, which Hellpoint calls breaches, is extremely rare, so instead you just have to desperately hope to find a shortcut connecting back to previous regions if you don't want to do a ton of backtracking. For that reason, it's good that breaches not only heal you, but they also don't come with the drawback of respawning enemies. That happens on a clock instead. I'd have been pretty fed up if I'd had to deal with killing the same enemies over and over. When you do eventually die, which happens a lot in this kind of game, not only do you drop all of your experience points, but you'll spawn a ghost version of your character with the same weapons that you were using. Those are tough fights, but combat is Hellpoint's strongest aspect. Not for the reasons I expected though. Moment-to-moment gameplay felt floaty and a bit wonky at first, including awkward jumping that makes leaps across death pits difficult. But the fluidity of fights did eventually grow on me. Dodging is extremely quick and powerful if you can time your counterattacks well. Plus, there's plenty of variety in both melee and ranged weapons, and it's a cool touch that they unlock new powers the more that you use them. It's a shame there aren't a ton of enemy types, leading to lots of repetition throughout. The saving grace is that the enemies that do exist are all vastly different and creative. A high level of difficulty is a big draw for Souls-like games, but Hellpoint isn't very consistent in that regard. Naturally, the first few zones are extremely deadly and challenging, in part because you're still learning how combat works, but once things clicked, I found the difficulty curve to be choppy and inconsistent. Some of the later boss fights I was able to handle on the first try after dying nearly a dozen times on some of the earlier ones, which seems like the opposite of how that should go. Co-op works just like it does in Dark Souls, though here the messages you can leave for others are just indecipherable symbols. That's basically useless. You're also able to fight people to join your world, or you can directly join a friend's game using a unique code or in local co-op. It's fine, but I don't understand why Souls-like co-op always has to be so convoluted. The biggest things though that get in the way of Hellpoint trying to establish itself are the gratuitous bugs and performance issues that make it feel like it's struggling to deliver a fully functioning game. At one point, another player joined my session and my frame rate tanked into single digits. I also fell through the floor and everything went invisible, a menu was stuck on screen, and then there was all the unignorable texture pop-ins. Beyond that, some of Hellpoint's more interesting features are never really introduced or used in interesting ways. For example, the black hole the space station orbits around causes more and more powerful enemies to spawn, among other things, and it would have been nice to have some introduction to that concept so it could plan around it, but it just doesn't bother. Much of what Hellpoint lacks in original Souls-like gameplay mechanics, it makes up for with its stylish sci-fi aesthetic, creepy atmosphere, and relentless focus on making you uncomfortable. The frequent bugs are a major hindrance though, and it's far too derivative to step out of the shadow of the genre greats that came before. All that said, it does provide some decent old-fashioned video game punishment with satisfyingly brutal combat. For more on Hellpoint, you can watch the first 12 minutes of gameplay right here, and for everything else, stay tuned to IGN.